Good evening. I am Anthony Malley, a member of the World Affairs Series Planning Committee. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture, which is a part of the 2009 to 2010 World Affairs Series, Can We Save the World? Before we introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to thank our co-sponsors this evening, the Department of Political Science, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, formerly known as the College for Seniors, and the Committee on Lectures funded by the government of the student body. Tonight's event is the final event in the World Affairs Series this fall. In January, we will host Wendy Chamberlain, president of the Middle East Institute and former ambassador to Pakistan. She will speak on Wednesday, January 27th. Other upcoming events of interest include Congressman Ron Paul explaining his perspective on free markets and sound money in the Benton Auditorium this Friday at 7 p.m., Dr. Sabil Ahmed of the Gain Peace Project on Understanding Islam this Saturday at 2 p.m. in the South Ballroom, and Ogla Professor she will be speaking on Putin's Russia and the ideology of glamour on Tuesday, November 17th at 7:30 p.m., and there will also be a panel discussion with the authors of Postville, USA, Surviving Diversity in Small-Town America on Wednesday, November 18th at 7 p.m. in the Great Hall. All of these events are free and open to the public.
Thanks, Anthony. Welcome again. I'm Mike Thompson, a member of the World Affairs Series Planning Committee, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Tom Twedden. Mr. Twedden served 34 years in clandestine services for the Central Intelligence Agency before retiring in 1995. He worked under diplomatic cover in such locations as Libya, Ghana, India, Jordan, and was chief of the CIA's Near East and South Asian Division during the Soviet War in Afghanistan. During this time, he directed intelligence resources in support of new democracies in Eastern Europe, supported a coalition of allied forces in the Gulf War following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, and placed a new emphasis on fighting international narcotics trafficking, terrorism, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. He was twice awarded the Distinguished Intelligence Medal, the agency's highest honor. A native of Iowa, Mr. Twedden received his bachelor's degree from Iowa State and a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming him back to Iowa State and his alma mater this evening.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back at Iowa State. It's always a pleasure to come back. Can you hear me if I lean into that? Is that all? I need to be fairly close to that, don't I? Okay, I'm just testing a little bit on how friendly this microphone is. In a perfect world, we wouldn't need an intelligence agency. Everybody would be nice, and there'd be no problem with spies, and there would not be evil people wanting to do bad things to the United States. But I want to quote to you from John le Carré's novel, The Secret Pilgrim. And he said in this novel to a group of intelligence officers, "For as long as rogues become leaders, we shall spy. For as long as there are bullies and liars and madmen in the world, we shall spy. For as long as nations compete and politicians deceive and tyrants launch conquests and consumers need resources and the homeless look for food and the homeless look for land and the hungry for food and the rich for excess, the spying profession is secure." That's the bad news. Because we'd all like to live in a perfect world. But tonight we're going to talk about a big mess. And there it is. Afghan Pakistan and what it is that the American intelligence community does there in support of American strategy and the problems with squeezing al-Qaeda so that there is not another 9/11 attack on the United States. If any of you have finals tomorrow, I could give the punchline right now, which is al-Qaeda is not as dangerous as it was 8 years ago. It's still out there. It still intends to do a lot of harm to the United States, to you and me. We are not innocents in al-Qaeda's eyes, but it has been whittled down significantly since 9/11. Now, for those of you who have finals tomorrow morning, you're excused. We're going to talk about 3 wars tonight that are interlocking. The first one is in Afghanistan, and you've been reading a lot in your papers about Afghanistan. The Taliban goal in Afghanistan is to return to power. And the second war that we're going to consider tonight is in Pakistan. Pakistan is embroiled now in its own civil war. And those 2 wars are interlocking. But the Taliban, Pakistan Taliban, which is a completely separate entity cooperating with the Afghan Taliban, but separate entity, is intent on overthrowing the government of Pakistan. And the third war is the American war against al-Qaeda. And al-Qaeda has a lot to do with supplying advice and weapons and financial aid to the 2 Talibans, but al-Qaeda is the principal problem for us because they're the ones who lowered the Twin Towers in New York City, and they're the ones who'd like to do it again. The U.S. strategy, and this is not a CIA strategy, the U.S. strategy is to defeat and eliminate the al-Qaeda Central that operates along that Pakistan-Afghanistan border. CIA and the intelligence community are part of that American strategy, which is diplomatic, military, possibly nation-building. The president's having a hard time figuring out exactly how to do that, and I'll get to that problem a little later. I'm going to try not to talk about policy because I'm not a policymaker. I'm an intelligence officer, or was. And I encourage you to come to this lecture in late January from Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain. I don't know her, but I do know that she was the American ambassador in Pakistan at the time that Musharraf decided that it was politic to cooperate with the Americans immediately after 9/11. And she would have played an important role in that. Whether Musharraf played the game entirely straight after that for the next 2 or 3 years, when the Pakistan army was essentially playing a double game with continuing to support the Taliban, is something that I would encourage you to ask her. Because it really was a very difficult time. So I want to talk first about the first war. And the civil war in Afghanistan essentially started in 1979. The Russians invaded at the end of December in order to support the Brezhnev Doctrine. To paraphrase Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, the world will little note nor long remember the Brezhnev Doctrine. And there probably aren't too many people here who can tell you what it is, and it is of wonderfully little importance at this point. The Brezhnev Doctrine in shorthand was that once a country became socialist, which meant communist in their speaking version, was that it could never go back to being non-socialist. And the Soviets had installed a communist government. It wasn't working very well. The Afghans were rebelling against it. It looked like it was going to be overthrown very soon. So the Russians, December 1979, killed the communist prime minister, installed another one, and he invited the Russian troops to come in. The Afghan Mujahideen fought the mighty Red Army for the next 10 years. Jimmy Carter was in his last days of the White House, you who are older may remember, and he had acquired a well-deserved reputation for not standing up to the Russians. Very fine man, but he was not a staunch anti-communist fighter like his successor, President Reagan. So he initiated what is called a covert finding. A finding is a piece of paper which is signed by the president that says the CIA should do the following things secretly. And that is the marching orders for covert action by the agency. His finding was non-lethal, which means make sure that nobody gets hurt with the things that we provide. And so the CIA was immediately funding, through the Pakistanis, boots and first aid kits and warm winter jackets and nice things that didn't do any harm. And the Mujahideen were mildly grateful, I'm sure. President Reagan came in with his CIA director, Bill Casey, who was a real piece of work. And these two fellas were going to up the ante, something ferocious, and they immediately signed a series of lethal findings. Now, it's still the same thing, signed by the president, briefed to the Congress in great detail, lots and lots of oversight, as it should be from both the executive and the legislative branches, because it's pretty dicey stuff. And the lethal findings said CIA should and will provide weapons and whatever else it takes to, first of all, hurt the mighty Red Army from the USSR, and secondly, to throw them out. And I will tell you in all truth that none of us believed that the mighty Red Army was going to leave. But we were pretty sure that the Afghans were prepared to hurt them pretty badly. So we gathered a lot of non-American weapons, because if it's covert, you can't have American weapons out there on the battlefield. And we gathered up some weapons from Egypt and Turkey and South America and lots of other places that I probably shouldn't name. Because everybody was really upset with the Russians, and everybody was willing to cooperate as long as it was secret. People like secrets when they get harmed if it isn't secret. And that's one of the main reasons why covert actions take place, is because the other countries involved need to have it being really low-key and not hit the press. Well, to make a long story short, we sent in an awful lot of weapons. And we sent them in on an awful lot of mules. Pakistan and Afghanistan had a shortage of mules in those days, and we bought mules. The CIA, under my direction, bought mules in Argentina and Chile and China. Arkansas has no mules left. We had a great time. And the logistics mechanism, because that's all we were, was a logistics mechanism, was pretty potent, because the Congress kept giving us more money than we asked for. And it got kind of hard to spend all the money that they were throwing at us on this war. And then Bill Casey who was pretty ferocious as an anti-communist, decided to up the ante, and he asked the king of Saudi Arabia if he wouldn't like to match the funds. So all of a sudden, instead of spending something like $100 million, we had $1 billion a year to spend on the Afghan war. And it worked. It was one of the great covert action programs of the history of the agency. It was easily the biggest one. And it did take 5 or 6 years, but the Afghans, not the Americans, that's an interesting point, isn't it? The Afghans threw the Russians out of their own country. All we did was give them a little help. And you know what? There were no American casualties. 0. No one was wounded, and no one was killed who was an American. In fact, we never stepped foot in Afghanistan. So there I was. I worked on this program for 9 years, and I never stepped across the border. I was in Pakistan once or twice a year for several years. But it was all indirect, and the people who were saving their own country saved it themselves. Unfortunately, 1989, the Russians left. The diplomats made an agreement, and we sat back and watched the 7 fighting factions try to work out Afghan democracy. And Afghan democracy, as we thought it would be, was pretty much shelling each other with those weapons that we'd given them to fight the Russians. So the killing went on, and the civil war really got started. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was one of the best of the groups and very anti-American, but cooperated with us nevertheless, a real Islamist who's still on the scene, he pretty much destroyed the city of Kabul. And that was the beginning of the Taliban, because the Pakistanis, for strategic reasons, need to have a peaceful Afghanistan on their western border. No input. And so strategically, the Pakistanis had to have something that was neutral or even better, friendly with Pakistan. And that strategic goal of Pakistan remains today. They are frightened to death that the Indians, their archenemy, will be the best friend of Afghanistan, give them a lot of economic aid, and lessen the Pakistan influence on Afghanistan. For that reason, the Pakistanis founded, in desperation, because the warlords had gone crazy and were fighting each other, founded the Taliban. And it was one of those unintended consequences of our covert action, because the Pakistan army had fought several wars with India. They were always unsuccessful. They always will be. They're too small. And although the Pakistan army considers itself to be the main nationalist protector and institution of the country, they in fact have done very little to support the national interest of Pakistan, except the 1980s war in which they helped throw out the mighty Red Army. So the Taliban are pretty much uneducated. 40% of Afghan teachers are women. In the 1970s and 80s, the Taliban send them all home. they're uneducated. They know that only men can do jobs outside the home. And Afghanistan becomes a very messy place. And in fact, I started calling it Humpty Dumpty about that time, because it's very hard to see how you can put that back together. So here we are today. Humpty Dumpty remains. Karzai is a very weak president. He was betrayed by the international community. The central government in Afghanistan is an oxymoron because it's such a rich tribal society, proud of its tribal loyalties, and very intransigent when it comes to outside interference. It is said that Karzai's brother is a friend of the CIA. I don't know if any of you saw a New York Times article last year that was rather breathless about this man who has made a lot of money, who happens to be Karzai's brother. He's probably a very corrupt person. He might even be in the drugs business. The article said might because there doesn't seem to be any great proof of that. But it's quite possible that he is. He's maybe not a very good man. So I'm going to come back to that in a little bit because it's one of those questions about what's the alternative. If you don't want to let the Taliban back in power, and there isn't an army or a police force ready yet, and you've got a major question about how much we're going to expend in terms of funds to build that nation, then you have to decide whether you're going to work with some people that might not be squeaky clean. So I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. The second war is the civil war in Pakistan. The president of Pakistan is now the weakest civilian leader in Pakistan's history, which of course only goes back to 1947. But I would give him perhaps another year before he irritates the Pakistan army so thoroughly that he is overthrown. He is a very corrupt businessman who happened to be Benazir Bhutto's husband. Benazir Bhutto was assassinated by the Pakistan Taliban, and so he came into political power as a sort of on the coattails of the Bhutto family. The Bhutto family is one of the problems in Pakistan because most of the political class are landowners. They are pretty much anti-education and anti-development. They're quite happy with their situation. Pakistan badly needs to improve its economy, and that includes land reform. India did its land reform in 1946 and 47. Pakistan hasn't gotten around to it. And it's a severe problem because the Taliban are appealing to the class divides between the mass of uneducated people and the Pakistan political class. There has also been in Pakistan over the years an overinvestment in the military. So you have at this point a situation in which the military is the problem because it's a major player in the economy, and it's also the solution because nobody else is going to take care of the Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban. The U.S. strategy in this fight is to assist investment in the economy. There was a handsome aid bill passed a month or two ago in which more than $5 billion was given to over a period of several years was given to Pakistan. You would think that there would be a handsome thank you for that kind of money. Instead, the U.S. Congress, in all its wisdom, attached a string. And the string was the civilian political power should, which I've already said is very weak, should bring stronger control over the military, which in theory isn't a bad idea at all. But all it did really by having that string there was irritate the Pakistan military something ferocious, and it will probably give some second thoughts to the kind of cooperation that the U.S. military and the CIA are needing in that second war. There's an important point to be made along this border right here between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that is U.S. troops are on this side, and that's the war zone. Afghanistan is the war zone for U.S., all those military U.S. forces. And the problem that we're really after is on this side. Al-Qaeda is primarily believed to be down in this corner in South Waziristan. And that's the war that you and I fought most strongly because and I'll come to that third war in just a minute. But the problem for the U.S. military is their war zone stops on that border. And Pakistan's sovereignty does not permit the U.S. military to come over on that border, on that side of the border. And that both sides of the border are ferociously difficult terrain. So if you're going to help Pakistan fight the Taliban in Pakistan, who's going to do it? Because the U.S. military can't. They're prohibited from being in uniform across that border. And the answer, of course, you guessed it from the speaker who's in front of you, is the CIA. And yet another covert finding. And this covert finding, which I haven't read because I retired in 1995, probably says something like, find ways to get the Pakistan army to focus on the real problem and to acknowledge that they really do have a civil war against the mechanism that they founded. So you can begin to see the problem. This is like Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, when he first came into office, called it a three-dimensional chess game, because there are layers and layers of who's on which side, and there's no question that the Pakistan military has been supporting the Taliban that are shooting at U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and also supporting, to some extent, the mechanism in the Punjab, also Islamists, that they also founded after the 1980s war. And they founded that in order to fight the battle in Kashmir against the Indians. Didn't work, but it was their version of a covert action. And now, having born these two babies of terrorism, they are finding that they both children have turned on them and are trying to eat the adult, the Pakistan army, and overthrow the state. So it's a pretty good sized mess in Pakistan. And the best that the CIA can do is to push and assist, share intelligence with the Pakistanis, and eventually get them to focus on South Waziristan, which is what they're doing right now. There's a major offensive, as you know from your newspaper, in South Waziristan, in which the Pakistan army tried everything possible to find a way not to do it. But after the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, the Pakistan army, this is less than a year ago, finally decided that the Taliban wanted to throw him out of office, destroy the state of Pakistan. After the Taliban took over the Swat Valley and started coming down toward Islamabad from the Swat Valley, the Pakistan army said, gee, this is a serious situation. And after the Pakistan attack on India in Mumbai, the Taliban attack on India, in which the Pakistan army almost certainly played no role, but it was this mechanism that had been born that continued to find ways to attack India anyway. And I have no doubt that some of the Pakistan military officers who had retired, whom I knew pretty well, were still finding ways to individually, in retirement, support those Islamists in the Punjab who sponsored the attack on Mumbai. So you might ask, what happens if there's another Islamist attack on India from Pakistan? There's a pretty good chance that could happen. And if that happens, the Indian army will come across this border toward Islamabad and Lahore. They will, for Indian political reasons, retaliate. And if that happens, what do you suppose happens to that Pakistan army that's over on this side of the border in South Waziristan? Well, unfortunately, they're going to not bother with South Waziristan. They're going to head for the Indians. So it has some potential. And if you're, say, Al-Qaeda or Pakistan Taliban, would you think it might be quite possible that the Indians would, that the Pakistani military would, since they're going to run for the Indian border, wouldn't you maybe be more encouraged to attack India? So I'm afraid that I have to predict the likelihood, because it's so much in the Taliban interest, that there will be another attack, and then all hell breaks loose in the Pakistan Civil War. The third war, I'll try not to be quite so depressing about. The third war is our war. It's to pressure, disrupt, and destroy to the maximum extent possible Al-Qaeda training, planning, communications, and that is mostly on the border and has been primarily believed to be in South Waziristan, which is exactly where the Pakistan army is attacking right now. Very much in our interests. So the second war overlaps because the Pakistan army finally is taking the threat seriously and is finally helping us in rooting out the Al-Qaeda on that border. Al-Qaeda still intends to do major damage in the U.S. You might note that there has not been a successful attack in the U.S. since 9/11. That's a major achievement. And the intelligence community is primarily responsible for that, not just CIA, but also NSA. The FBI is much better intelligence. They've made major improvements in protecting the homeland since 9/11. And I have to assure you that the American people are a great deal more safe than they were 8 years ago. Doesn't mean that it couldn't still happen, and there was an attempt just 2 months ago that was first uncovered when a young Afghan who grew up in New York City was seen to be in Pakistan, went to a training camp in South Waziristan, an Al-Qaeda camp. He came back home, moved to Denver. He went through Iowa about 2 months ago, about as fast as he could drive, going from Denver to New York City. He arrived in New York City about the time that the president was due to speak to the United Nations. He talked to some of his buddies down on near Wall Street, next to a building in which the president was going to make an appearance 2 days later, and in a joint operation by the FBI and the New York City Police, who are finally working together well after a lot of years of rivalry, he was arrested. Now, the FBI had charged him with an attempt to a conspiracy to do terrorist act. And so he's safely in their clutches for quite some time. Eventually, they are very good at interrogation. They do all the routines that good interrogators do, good cop, bad cop. And he might talk, but he's certainly got a defense lawyer who's saying don't say anything. So whether they get something out of him about whether there was anybody else involved is fairly doubtful, in my view. We'll find that out when he comes to trial. But the FBI's got a really tough job to get anything out of this guy on motivation. One thing I can tell you for sure is that he won't be waterboarded. There isn't going to be any aggressive interrogation of this guy because he is an American of Afghan descent, and because the current administration has said we aren't going to do that anymore, which is a good idea. You can understand why it happened, why the CIA was ordered to do aggressive interrogation, even though the CIA had no experience in interrogation. And that was because we had that trauma on 9/11, and when you have a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11, the political mechanism will always go to excess in trying to write it. 9/11 represents a failure of the American government to protect its people. So you can understand why the administration at that time said, that's not going to happen again, not on our watch. And the main mechanism to make sure it didn't happen again was an aggressive CIA program of rendition and aggressive interrogation. Sheikh Mohammed, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, was the author of 9/11. He's the guy who brought the plan to bin Laden and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to fly airplanes into the Pentagon. And his initial plan was also Los Angeles and San Francisco and several other places. The plan was whittled back to make it more secure. It was an awful thing. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, we are told, was waterboarded over 100 times. And my initial reaction to that is, couldn't happen to a nicer guy. You know, this is the guy who killed 3,000 Americans on our territory. But fortunately, in my view, we've stepped back from that, and we have returned to values that will not permit torture, and we should not, hopefully will not, do that again. The fall guy in this, unfortunately, is not the politicians who ordered the CIA to do it, and not the lawyers who wrote the instructions. Because George Tenet, the CIA director at the time, said, okay, we'll do that, but give me writing in specific detail on exactly which ones of those things are valid and permissible and which not. It took a year with repeated requests for that specific guidance before George Tenet was given that guidance on what the agency could and could not do in interrogation. And now there's an investigation, yet another one of the FBI, of the CIA, to uncover whether there were any officers who went too far in those interrogations. Now, this is the same agency that was pretty badly damaged by the 9/11 Commission and the Congress, who passed a reform bill in 2004 for doing too little. Although they were the only ones working on Al-Qaeda before 9/11. So there's kind of a dark cloud hanging over the officers of CIA right now, and they're pretty nervous about what's going to happen with this investigation. And that's not such good news, because quality intelligence officers are the backbone of having a quality intelligence organization. I have not wanted to talk about U.S. policy, but I have to say a couple things, because the President is doing a major scrub right now, and General McChrystal was given the command about 4 months ago. He knew what the challenge was. He's chosen in order to win. This is a four-star general who is accustomed to success. And he goes out to Afghanistan with a lot of really smart advice from civilian sociologists and counterinsurgency experts, a few of them that I know, and the academic community. Everybody is asked to pitch in on what the best strategy is. And the best strategy in March, we now know in November, is not working. The Taliban in Afghanistan is gaining strength. Now, let me come back to that point, because here's where the U.S. troops are. I've already said the important war is on this side of the border, and the CIA is making some progress on eliminating the Taliban on this side, right there. And so, why are we doing Afghanistan at all? And the answer is, the more pressure you can put on the Al-Qaeda, and the smaller you can make the circle where they feel safe, the less likely they are to succeed in attacking the U.S. homeland. So it's really important to have a strategy that unites all three of those wars and focuses attention on South Waziristan or wherever else we can find Al-Qaeda. It's just like pheasant hunting at this point, because what you want to do is flush those birds out of South Waziristan and make their life really difficult. The major weapon, tactical weapon for making the life difficult for Taliban now is the CIA Predator drone. If you made a list at the beginning of 2009 of the 20 most important Al-Qaeda persons along that border, with bin Laden first and the Egyptian terrorist Zawahiri second, 14 out of those 20 are now dead. All killed by the CIA drone, to the great consternation of al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So there have been a fair number of retaliatory attacks on civilians in Pakistan in order to persuade the government not to permit this to happen. And you'll see a fair amount of press that even seeps into the U.S. press about, oh my goodness, this is a really terrible thing, these drones, because they're flying there without the Pakistan government approval. And the Pakistan politicians in their talk shows will say, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, these American drones, they aren't so good. But in fact, there's nothing more important to Pakistan right now than killing al-Qaeda and the Pakistan Taliban leadership along that border. And 3 months ago, and this was a first, one of the American drones took out the leader, the chief of the Pakistan Taliban, who was at home with 7 bodyguards in the middle of the night, and a precision strike killed them all. He's the same guy that assassinated, arranged the operation to assassinate Benazir Bhutto. And there's no way that can happen without superb cooperation between the Pakistan intelligence, military intelligence, the ISI, and the CIA. Finally, we have persuaded the Pakistanis that it's really important to them to share on-ground intelligence in the areas that are most difficult. So I started talking about General McChrystal, who wants to do counterinsurgency, and that's a good thing to do in Afghanistan, because the country is Humpty Dumpty, and he wants to transform the way the U.S. Army has operated. That's a big job, to change the mission from killing Taliban and killing al-Qaeda to protecting the population from the Taliban. And frankly, I'm not sure that his workforce is capable of it. We've got a problem in the country at this point with too few soldiers being asked to do too much for us. An awful lot of these young men are on their men and women are on their 3rd and 4th combat tours. I don't think they can sustain it for 10 or 15 years. And if we're talking about a counterinsurgency program, we're talking about the U.S. Army having to be there for 10 or 15 years. And this is obviously why the president's having a really tough time with this scrub, because there are no really good options. But he knows what I've told you, and that is, if you want to eliminate al-Qaeda in here, you have to keep the pressure on. You have to make that circle smaller and smaller, or they're going to revive. And if the Taliban is permitted to take power again in Afghanistan, then al-Qaeda moves back across the border, and we're right back to where we were the year before 9/11. Very difficult to put them out if they've got access to the entire, and that's a big country, and it's mostly mountains and desert, and it's very difficult to get in there and get at them. So, there you have it. CIA, NSA, FBI, the intelligence organizations are in the front line. The smaller the circle, the better the protection for you and me. You have still, despite the pressures from the political mechanism in this country, you still have, in my view, the best intelligence organization in the world. It is dependent on high-quality people, If you have second-rate people in intelligence, you have a second-rate organization. They do not expect applause. They want to do their work in quiet. They believe in secrets in the national interest. And like our troops, they deserve your support and your thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Twetton. Mr. Twetton will be happy to take questions from the audience, but first I'd like to invite you to join us after the Q&A for a reception hosted by us, the World Affairs Series. And we'd ask that for the sake of the speaker and other audience members that those asking questions use the microphone, which is right over there. We also respectfully request that students with questions be given priority. Thank you.
And I see no questions, so thank you very much. No,
What's the
Yes,
relationship? What's the relationship between Al Qaeda and the Taliban? Do they have the same sort of goals? Are they in any way linked and coordinated and all that?
Yeah, the Al Qaeda is the senior organization, and they provide a lot of funding and advice. And most of Al Qaeda along that border are foreigners. Egyptians, a few Saudis. There have been a few reports of some of those foreigners leaving the border, saying, it's pretty dangerous right now, I think I'll go home for a while. That's the kind of pressure that we want to keep up on them. But Al-Qaeda is very much the big brother to Taliban, who came up through religious schools. There have been religious schools now for 3 decades in Pakistan, turning out Afghans and Pakistanis. Goes back to the 80s, in fact, when the Saudis were funding religious schools. Those religious schools have been for 30 years turning out young boys, never girls, who understand the Quran and have been indoctrinated to believe that the Quran has all the answers, and they're indoctrinated to kill for Islam. I want to say, and I'm really pleased to hear that there's a lecture this Saturday about understanding Islam, because the central point I make about Islam and the Taliban is that this podium in the world of Islam represents Al-Qaeda, and this room represents a Muslim religion that is dedicated to peace. We are not fighting Islam. We're fighting Al-Qaeda.
Good evening, sir. I had 2 questions, basically. The first question was, is political instigation prevalent in Pakistan? Is political instigation one of the reasons for, most of these terrorist attacks? Are politicians involved in these attacks? Politicians in Pakistan or Afghanistan?
You want me to answer that first before you do the second question?
Oh, yeah, the second was
I don't know that they are, I don't know, to tell you to give you the simple answer. I don't know. I have seen no evidence that Pakistan mainline politicians are involved in the attacks. There is as you know, a religious party, which is the main opposition party in Pakistan. It is hoping to gain power, but there's no hint that I know of that they are using terrorism to further those attacks.
Okay, and my second question was, last year when I was in India, I saw a video footage of terrorists and young college-going lads being trained, which was probably from the American satellites. So what has been done about it? And also about the Pakistan occupied in the Kashmir, and that part, POK, what has been America's attempt to pressurize Pakistan about it?
Yeah, we've unleashed a bully diplomat whose name is Richard Holbrooke, who is a smart enough and tough enough guy that he got the Serbs to sign the Dayton Accords, which was his really major feat. He's probably not the Secretary of State today because he is a bully. He doesn't get along very well with normal people. And we are hearing a lot of reports, or I am indirectly, of Richard Holbrooke's unpopularity. The first thing he was told when he went to India was, yes, we're very pleased to talk to you, but we'll talk about anything else except Kashmir. The Indian government would not tolerate the idea of the Americans interfering in the Kashmir problem. The Kashmir problem is to South Asia what the Palestine-Israeli problem is to the Middle East. Until you solve that problem and get the Indians and Pakistanis to sit down together, we are not going to have peace in that region, and it's very dangerous because you've got two nuclear powers who are very distrustful of each other.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to put some comment and I want to ask a question. Number one, for a lecture, you don't have to say something like about Islam, because there's many things it's happening from countries, not from Muslims, and the wars, and it's what's happening in Afghanistan is not really from Muslims or understanding of Muslims. They define their country as they want, because they're born and they find that the American, they are exist in their country. And another one, what's happening in Iraq maybe is the same, and it will cost a lot for U.S. That's what I found from watching news. The existence of U.S. solved the problem with the Soviet, with Afghanistan, solved the problem of Saddam Hussein. I'm a Kuwaiti, and I will say it like U.S. saved us. But this still existing there, and the country like Iraq and Afghanistan, they don't need the existence of U.S. Army there, because each country, if it wants to stand up again, they need to make something like a new civil war. Even the U.S., when it starts existing, there's a civil war which exists in this country. It make it like 15 states. They didn't become 15 states they discovered the U.S. And the other one, do you think that it's really important?
Well, wait a minute. Maybe you better let me try and say something about that. I'm not sure I entirely understood your question, but I think I get the drift, which is that quite possibly the U.S. Army in Afghanistan is like the Pakistan Army, is both the problem and the solution, or the potential solution. And that's what the president and his national security team are trying to figure out now, and that is it possible for the U.S. military to benefit the Afghan people by doing counterinsurgency? How much will it cost? How long do we have to stay? And what is the alternative if the Afghan people really don't want us? And you do have this civil war in which the Taliban, coming down from the Pashtun side of the population, are definitely anti-U.S. military. It looks like one more invader. The difference is, in my view, that the Russian army in 1979 came across that border to impose the Russian will on the Afghan people. The American army it seems to me, is quite different. And that is that they were they are there in order to assist the Afghan people.
I didn't.
And if the Afghan people don't want them, then we're going to have to leave quickly.
So
But it is a civil war, so you've got obviously a divided population in Afghanistan about whether they should or should not stay.
So is there's any negative effects if American army came back and gone out from Afghanistan? Or it would be the same?
I'm sorry, say that again?
If the American army still exists in Afghanistan and stay for like 15 years, as you say, the war will stay like rolling in this 15 years. But if the U.S. Army came back to U.S., the war will still there, but it will be in the Afghan. The U.S. Army will never lose anything. Even the youth people from the U.S., they will never die for. They are dying for the Afghans, actually, not for America.
Well, you might be right. I hope not, but I do have a theory that the worst American foreign policy decision in the last 60 years was our invasion in 2003 of Iraq, because that promoted the notion that we were just like Napoleon, who invaded Egypt in 1802 and began European colonial occupation of the Middle East, which lasted until World War II, mostly French and mostly English. And most of the problems of the Middle East today are an outgrowth of that colonial occupation. All that the U.S. did by invading Iraq in 2003 was to identify ourselves among all Muslim minds as the new colonial occupiers. And that's, I think, really what you're getting at, is how do we get over that? So I think we better move on and let somebody else have the next question. Thank you very much.
How do the other surrounding countries, such as India, China, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, feel towards the Taliban in the region?
Well, those are all countries that are trying to figure out how much democracy they want, and they pretty much have the old-style Russian totalitarian regimes. The worst of the worst on that border in terms of foreign fighters are Uzbeki, and they are there because they can't go home. There is no toleration of Islamic fundamentalism in the countries that you've named, and that's their style of dealing with it. They're just going to fight it and not permit it.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned earlier some of our reaction to 9/11 was these extreme interrogation methods. That was abroad. At home, we had the Patriot Act, and it has some serious implications for both our personal safety and our personal freedoms. I was wondering if you could comment on how we can strike a balance between being safe and potentially living in a 1984 type world. I mean, as a member of the intelligence community, where should we have that balance?
I don't know exactly where that line is, except that I can tell you that it's one of the problems that the intelligence community doesn't have anything to do with it. It's a Homeland Security FBI problem, and I'm really not, other than being a member of the library board in Crestbury, Vermont, And I can tell you that we've got some concerns about what the Patriot Act does. I'm not an expert on that. I'm really not. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned it-
I will say I think you got a valid concern, and the Patriot Act does need to have some more tinkering with. Yeah.
You mentioned in your talk that all those people are illiterates, right? Now, my question is, we, with all our intellect, we get up every morning and go for an exam. We are slogging hard all our lives, studying with books. So what do they have that we cannot crush that group of people? Is it Pakistan? For example, US has clear-cut policies that we are going to fight terrorism on these borders. Why? My question is, why cannot US be in the uniform across that border? Does Pakistan really stand up and say, no, if US is fighting terrorism, we can't let them fight the terrorism. We aren't going to let them in our border. Do they make it clear, or are they very equivocal about it? And what do those people possess that we don't, that we really cannot crush them?
Aha. Well, I guess I'd have to say that we have discovered since Mr. Rumsfeld came into the being as the Secretary of Defense that there are, after all, limits to American power. And that's a good thing. There's entirely too much arrogance to that man's dealing with the rest of the world, both Europe and the rest of the parts. One of the primary things you have to consider when you're dealing with an entity that isn't working very well is that they do have a nationalist pride in their sovereignty. And so if you want them as an ally in a joint struggle, you have to treat them as equals. As ill as the Pakistan body politic is, in my estimation, it has to be treated as an equal partner. Now, if the other part of your question is, why haven't we found bin Laden? I'll be damned if I know the answer. It just really shouldn't be that hard. But it didn't happen on my watch.
So
Thank you. Go ahead.
Is there no one to ask this question from Pakistan that their being treated equals is causing so many people to die? We are dying at the cost of their not being treated as equals. Who is there to ask that question from them?
Well, you're talking about people, aren't you? It's how you talk to people of other cultures that makes them want to work with you on a difficult problem. And I would say the same applies to any country in the world, that you have to understand their system, and you have to understand what makes them tick as individuals. You have to understand how to make the Pakistan system work, even though the president is a crook. It's not anything that's black and white. But thank you very much for your question. Time for one more question. And fortunately, there's one more person there.
I'll try to make it brief. My question is, if Al-Qaeda is primarily the source of funding for the Taliban, where are they getting their funding, and how are we dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Some of it is coming from heroin growing. The Afghan farmer gets $400 a hectare for growing wheat. He gets $13,000 a hectare for growing poppies. So you got to figure out some ways to handle the problem other than telling him he can't grow poppies anymore. It has succeeded in other places by just buying up the whole crop and doing with it what you want, but we don't really want to spend that much money. This is one of the major problems in this policy discussion right now is how do you get this to wind down without having to spend 15 years and a whole lot of U.S. money? That is when we've been putting so much money out on our own domestic problems. The other source of money for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is coming from individuals in the Arab Gulf and maybe elsewhere in the Arab world, but most of the money that is available is coming from Arabia, not just Saudi Arabia, but Abu Dhabi. And they're working hard to shut that down. They've been working on it for 8 years, but there's increasing technology sophistication at getting at those informal mechanisms for moving money around. And so I was down in Washington 2 months ago, and they said they're making progress on the money. I don't think they're ever going to get it to shut off entirely. Thank you very much for your patience and for listening.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to have the reception back there, and thanks for coming. We'll see you again. We had that guy was kept going. We were thinking about cutting him off.
I didn't have any idea what he said.
There's a sign up there. There's a sign. Oh.
Good. How are you?